Sephora stores are everywhere you are. So just pop in. When you need a brown lip to match your 90s playlist. A confidence boost before your interview? Or a last-minute gift for mom's birthday. There's always a Sephora near you. Just pop in. Use our store locator to find your local Sephora or Sephora at Kohl's.
This episode is brought to you by National Geographic, presenting its new documentary film, Endurance. Follow the greatest survival story ever told, unpacking the legendary feat of polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, who kept his crew alive for over a year, despite losing their ship in frigid pack ice. Over a century later, a team of modern-day explorers set out to find the sunken ship. Endurance, now streaming on Hulu and Disney+.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I welcome a special guest back to the show. It's been a while. Lacey Bonar Hall. Lacey, welcome back.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
Oh, I'm so good, and I'm so happy to have you here today. You just accomplished something pretty big, did you not?
I did. I just submitted my doctoral dissertation, so I'm excited to be chatting about that a little bit today.
Yeah, I can't wait. So today's topic is one that I've never done on the show, and I think it's one people are really going to be interested in. Why don't you tell everybody what we're going to be talking about?
So we are going to be talking about beauty in the medieval period, and it kind of flows a little bit into the period of the Tudors, too. I like to say that my cutoff is around like the year 1500, 1550-ish for the stuff that I talk about. So we'll be going from the 12th century to the 16th century, talking about beauty standards and cosmetics and all things women's faces.
I think when we think of beauty in the Middle Ages or in the medieval time, we reference in our head certain people, right? So for me, immediately I go to Elizabeth Woodville because she was the standard of beauty, wasn't she?
She was, yeah. So she was really the quintessential beauty for especially the 15th century. But the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, it predates Elizabeth Woodville by a couple centuries. But I think we can use her and that really iconic portrait of her that people think of when you think about Elizabeth Woodville. We can see where her conception of beauty comes from, this beauty standard that she was trying to emulate, really. That's what we're going to be talking about. I love Elizabeth Woodville, so I'm excited.
Oh, I love her too. Okay, so let's go back a few centuries then. Where do you want to start with this?
So I want to start with the 12th century. That's where we really start to see what scholars call the canon of beauty developing for the medieval period. And that is when the standard of beauty that we see carrying through for at least 4 or 5 centuries. That's where it really starts to develop. So in the 12th century, we have these guides to poetry that were being written by these scholars who they wanted to teach people how to write effective prose and effective poetry. They were giving them all of these guidelines of, how to write something that's engaging and entertaining for your audience, because we're talking about a time period that very much predates television and radio and social media. The things that we go to today for our sources of entertainment, they didn't exist. And people had, no conception of what television would even be like. They were having their entertainment. It was coming from things like books and storytelling. So you have these guides to poetry or these guides to writing that are aiming to tell people how you are going to use your writing to convey these messages, to write something that people want to read and that they want to listen to. And one of the things that we see popping up time and again in these different guides to writing in the 12th century is descriptions of women's exterior. So you have these women's, especially their faces from the top of their head down to their neck, these really elaborate descriptions of how you're going to describe a beautiful woman. And they're pretty standard. So this is when we start to see this standard of beauty developing in these sources. And I'm going to give you an idea of what some of these different, especially facial features were that were used to describe beautiful women in these different literary sources. So there's the ones that I think, typically think of when we think of someone like Elizabeth Woodville. So you think of the golden blonde hair. She, in that portrait, has that little red, they call it like a kissable mouth. is kind of funny, to think
Yeah.
about the medieval period. And then these, like the shining eyes that are usually they're light in color. We see a lot of references to blue eyes or to gray eyes for women, but they get really specific with these facial features. So we see in these guides to writing, they're talking about straight, small noses, straight, well-spaced teeth, dark eyebrows with a milky white space in between. And they're very specific about that. There has to be this space in between the eyebrows, something that we don't really think of today, but that popped up in these sources time and time again. They talk about broad white foreheads, which is something that when you look at that portrait of Elizabeth Woodville, her forehead is pretty sizable. And it looks like she has sort of a receding hairline, which is something that I'll touch on today too. But that's this broad, white, milky, just spacious forehead that they saw as being really beautiful. And one of these guides to writing, I think they really captured how women were supposed to try to achieve this really inachievable look. This guy, he summed up his description of women's faces by saying that women should have, quote, a face like the dawn, neither rosy nor white, but of both and neither color at the same time.
Seriously.
It's just like, Jeffrey, how are we supposed to achieve that? But he was laying out this beauty ideal that women were expected to achieve. And this really, it took on a life of its own. So we see a lot of the works of literature, like those heavy hitters that come out of the Central and later Middle Ages. So like the Arthurian legends, the Romance of the Rose, these really, really popular works, they use this standard of beauty. They describe women from the tops of their heads, sometimes all the way down to their feet, and they describe them in this very standardized way, which is why scholars today do call this a beauty standard or a canon of beauty. Very much like how, we tend to think of, I think, stereotypical beauties today. That was very much a thing in the medieval period. It was just they used their words, to describe this beauty instead of the screen, which is obviously what what we think of in the 21st century. But I did want to point out one example of an author who I think used this description of a beautiful woman in direct contrast to an ugly woman in his sources. And it's Chrétien de Troyes. Sorry to any of our French listeners. I've been very much told that I have an Americanized French accent, but he was one of these writers who was working in the late 12th century. So he was writing right around like 1175 to the 1190s, and he was actually working at the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, Marie. And of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine is another one of these really quintessential beauties that people think of when they think of the medieval period, even though we don't really know very much about what Eleanor actually looked like, because we don't have, as many descriptions or lifelike depictions of Eleanor like we do of someone from a later period like Elizabeth Woodville. But her daughter, Eleanor's daughter, she was a countess, and she presided over her court where she really promoted literary works and authors. So she had different poets who she was patronizing at her court. Her court was known as being like the center of culture. And she employed Chrétien, who was famous for his Arthurian legends. And in one of his legends, the legend of Percival, he talks about these two women. One was a protagonist. So she in the tale was the beautiful, glorious damsel, and her name was Blanchefleur. And then he also talks about this antagonist, this bad woman who was the loathly damsel. So pretty indicative of her role in the tale. But when he's talking about Blanchefleur, he says she had golden hair. She had this high, white, smooth forehead. She had brown eyebrows with a wide space in between, and he specifies that, which I think is really interesting. Yeah. She had gray eyes, a long and straight nose, and crimson cheeks on a pale face. And he sums her up by saying that she to ravish men's hearts and minds. God had made her a marvel surpassing marvels. So he doesn't leave much to the imagination, right? The reader or the listener, they're hearing this and they know that she is a protagonist in the tale, right? She's a good woman. She's described as being so beautiful, that she's surpassing all other examples of beauty. But then there's the loathly damsel, which is one of these bad women that Percival encounters. And instead of fitting this beauty standard, she is described as just being hideous, so hideous that she's sort of more like an animal than like a human. So she's described as having hair in 2 large black braids that were twisted like horns. She had 2 small eyes, more like those of a rat than a human. So that's not,
No.
The nose of a cat or a monkey, which we get popping up in a lot of these different sources, describing women as having like a pug nose. The ears of a donkey or a cow, and just a kicker, a beard like a goat. So the lovely damsel, or the loathly damsel, is one who you don't really want to encounter, right? She's not beautiful. She's the opposite of being beautiful, but she again is described based on her external appearance, because that was the way that a lot of these authors at the time, they were like painting a picture with their words, right? That's what they had. People had to depend on their own imagination if they didn't have illustrations in the manuscripts that they were reading or listening to. They were like constructing these characters in their head. And the loathly damsel, you don't walk away with hearing that description and not have an image of just this really horrible looking woman. And that's one of the more mild examples that I found when I was working on this chapter of my dissertation that's engaging with these beauty standards and how authors use them in the medieval period to describe women and to signify like their inner qualities. That's what that's what this chapter is about in my project. But I found all of these examples from the 12th century on where these authors, they're describing women that were very animalistic. They were dirty. Some of them had maggots coming out of their eyes and their mouth. I mean, it's just really like this evocative description that is so repulsive and gross that you instantly know the role that woman is going to play in the story just based on her external appearance. And the same goes for these beautiful women, these women that had the blonde hair and the high broad forehead, and that especially that space between their eyebrows is something that they were really concerned with. And those were the good women. Those were the good women in these tales. And it's interesting to think about how the audience would have taken those descriptions, especially the women in the audience. A lot of these tales are, I think what we would say today is like, a little sexist in their descriptions. But at the time, it was just very much a standard way of writing and of signifying to your audience the role that these different characters played. They did, describe men to a certain extent, but not the same.
Let's be real. It's very similar to today.
It is. And it's sort of shocking. I mean, they, again, not to dwell on Chrétien and his Arthurian legends too much, but there's one where he describes the lead woman in the tale. He describes her, just a ton. He's talking about her external appearance and how it reflects her internal appearance. And he talks about her male counterpart, the main guy in the legend, and he doesn't hardly describe what he looks like at all. It's all about his honor and how he, keeps his oaths and how he's someone that you really want on your team because he's such a good guy. But he doesn't really give his audience anything to go off of what Eric looks like. He's just talking about how honorable he is and how brave he is. And he's such a great soldier, but you don't get the same description of his external appearance like you do of Enid, his female counterpart in the tale, which I think is interesting, but like you said, not entirely surprising.
Yeah. Like let's idealize the women. Here's what the women
Yeah,
should look like, but the men, they're honorable. They could be ugly, but they're honorable and they're good
yeah.
fighters. And
That is it, but that is like it's so interesting that women, they seem to really be, their character is boiled down to their external appearance, and their external appearance is used to communicate that inner character, which is something that I want to talk about in a minute. I want to talk about how this idea of beauty stretched to women's actual lives. So can I talk about that a little bit?
yeah, of course you can.
And stop me if I'm talking too much because I really, really geek out over this stuff. But I found some evidence from the 13th century where we can tell that women tried to emulate this idealized beauty standard, this way of looking and appearing to especially the men in your life that we see popping up in these guides to poetry and in these works of the legends, like the Arthurian legends and this popular literature. So there's a 13th century French song that a peddler allegedly used to sing to tell people of what, like when people would be walking by, he would sing this song to tell them about the different wares that he was selling. So the things that he had available to him that people could come up and purchase, on the side of the street or wherever it was that he was stationed. And supposedly the lyrics were, I have also all the utensils necessary for a lady. I have razors, tweezers, looking glasses, toothbrushes and toothpicks, and curling irons, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Ribbons, combs, mirrors, and rose water with which they furbish themselves. I have cotton with which they rouge, so that's blush, and whitening with which they whiten themselves. And that would be, to try to achieve this rosy and white face that is not achievable, but that, they tried saying was the ideal. So we know that supposedly there would have been a market for those things, that's what someone had with them selling on the side of the street because people would presumably be purchasing those different beauty tools and beauty enhancements off of peddlers, which is interesting because again, they're all geared toward women. And he says, that he has the things that are necessary for ladies to purchase. And I think when we start to think about this as being like a market for women, you could make money off of selling these beauty tools, and you could make money off of selling like blush and face whitening powder, which we can also get into some of those recipes here in a minute. They're very interesting, but there was a market for this. We have written proof of some of the surgeons that worked at even courts. So we're talking kings and queens and princes and princesses. We're talking about the nobility, all the way down to the peasantry, where they would be purchasing these different beauty tools and cosmetics to try to achieve this certain look because it was so pervasive. Whether it's kind of like a chicken and the egg thing, like did the literary descriptions of this beauty idea, did that come first, or were the literary descriptions just mimicking a beauty standard that was already present, in medieval society? We don't know, but we do know that it was so pervasive that we're seeing this certain beauty standard reflected across a really wide variety of medieval sources, which I think is exciting, and it's a neat insight into what was probably a major part of a lot of women's lives in the medieval period that we haven't really uncovered, I think, to its fullest extent.
Is this too early to ask you about the regular women? You're talking about these markets and this makeup being available. If you are a regular woman, not of noble birth, would you be adhering to these standards, and would you be able to afford the makeup that you would need?
Yeah, we think so. So, and again, it's something that's hard to tell just because we're kind of limited by our sources. But from what scholars have been able to uncover, it seems like there was a market for these cosmetics, especially because trade routes had started to open up throughout the medieval period. We have a lot of cosmetic recipes coming back with crusaders who had been to the Crusader state. So they're taking it's interesting because it's like a mixing pot of these different cultures when we're talking about the cosmetic trade and these different beautifying procedures and tools, where people are bringing them, especially from what we think of today as being the Middle East or the Holy Land, to them, and bringing it back to Western Europe, to where we're seeing these cosmetic recipes and practices being distilled through like not just the court surgeons, where you're talking about the upper class having access to these cosmetics and these tools, but we're seeing like local apothecaries and people like that peddler who are selling these cosmetics to just your average everyday person. And so there are some scholars who see this as really being kind of like how midwives could be like a career path for women, helping other women and being, paid by other women, where it was, a woman's realm to a certain extent, that cosmetics on a level where it's targeted more towards the peasant classes might have been something that was bought and sold by women in different, like local apothecary shops, or just people taking these cosmetics from market to market in these different towns, where women would know that they could come and purchase these things that they would need if they wanted to emulate this beauty standard, which is interesting because I think on the one hand, it's easy to think of women like Elizabeth Woodville. But if you do think of Elizabeth Woodville, and I do all day, every day, we think of her as being a queen, but she wasn't always. She was someone who, sure, she was born to a mother who was in, the upper echelons of English society due to her first marriage. But Elizabeth's father was very much just a regular knight. He wasn't someone who was in these upper echelons of society, and it knocked, her mom down a couple pegs when she married him socially. Of course, we do think it was probably a love match, but when she married him, she, was taken down a bit in her status. And Elizabeth was very much seen as being well beneath Edward IV when she married him, because she was seen as being, I don't want to say like the rabble, but I do think that's how some people, like probably her in-laws, would have seen her, because she wasn't someone who was in this very upper echelon of English society, which is very much who Edward IV should have been marrying. If he was going to marry someone who wasn't a foreign princess, he should have been marrying someone who was in the very upper nobility of English society, but he didn't. He married Elizabeth Woodville. And why people said he married her, aside from the false allegations of witchcraft, was because she was so beautiful and he just couldn't get past her beauty. We do know that she likely, just because that type of a hairline is not natural for most women, she likely at least engaged in hair plucking practices before she would have met Edward, because it was, again, a big beauty standard that you were supposed to have that high forehead. It was supposed to be very broad. You weren't supposed to, have any hair in between your eyebrows. So hair removal is something that I have found popping up, time and time again, where women were expected to, through one way or another, remove hairs from their face and their hairline in a way that ideally they wouldn't grow back, because they were trying to make this be a permanent way for them to achieve this beauty ideal. And some of the recipes that I have found, the ingredients that were used for especially hair removal, but for a ton of other beautifying procedures, they would have been ingredients that were really readily available and relatively cheap. Some of them you could forage for yourself. So these cosmetic recipes, especially, they would have been available to women on all social levels, which is something that, again, I think is interesting, because it can be really hard to locate those women in the sources, and to be able to find cosmetic recipes that were available to them and that were likely emulated by these women who wanted to achieve this certain ideal, I think it gives us some interesting insight into the things that concerned women at the time that might go hidden if we don't, know what we're looking for. And I will give one quick example of that. And again, Rebecca, I can talk about this for days, so stop me if I'm doing too much. But I found a 13th century cosmetic guidebook for women that is housed now in Oxford at the Bodleian, which is where I've been lucky enough to do some research. They have a fantastic collection of medieval manuscripts that are, some of them, are super popular and people look at all the time. And then other ones, more like this manuscript that I'm about to talk about, are very, in my opinion, understudied just because, there's only so many hours in the day for you to look at these things. But I was lucky enough to stumble upon this manuscript that is Anglo-Norman. It's in a collection of medical texts. So it's just a couple folios, so just a couple pages in this pretty big collection of medical texts. And it is called L'Ornement des Dames, so the ornamentation of women. And what we think is that it was likely authored by a man who was writing these different cosmetic recipes and beauty enhancement methods for the use of women. And he states that. I mean, we know, very clearly in his prologue what he's writing this manuscript for. But what's interesting is that he cites other women as being like the authorities on this in this branch of women's medicine is really what he seems to consider it. These cosmetic procedures and recipes, he's saying that they're coming from Trotta of Salerno, who is kind of a famous allegedly woman doctor from Salerno, or medical authority, and then he also cites a Muslim woman doctor who he says they're the experts. They're some of the leading experts in the world on women's cosmetics, and what he wanted to do was record their information for the use of English women for the most part. We think that that's where this manuscript itself originated, was somewhere in England in the 13th century. And he includes so many recipes that directly reflect that beauty standard that the literary authors had laid out. So just to give you a couple of examples of hair removal, because that is something that that I think we can still see like the after effects of that today, right? I mean, it's essentially he's recording like Nair. It's like the equivalent of what we have today as Nair. Wow. But he, is recording it obviously for a medieval audience. So he's using some different ingredients, I think, than what we would willingly put on our faces today. So he says, there are times when the eyebrows are too big. When this is the case, you can reduce them in this manner. First, pluck to your desired extent. So that would be using like the tweezers that the peddler said he was selling. And then he says, then take equal quantities of ant eggs and gum of ivy and orpiment, which I believe is a mineral that actually contains arsenic. So I would not recommend any of these, gentle listeners. Please don't try to make these concoctions yourself. But he says you take those three things, you mix them together and anoint the place where you want to remove the hair. And if you do that, it won't only remove the hair for the time being, but it should keep any hair from growing back in that place. So it's allegedly a permanent way to get rid of your hair. I'm sorry. He also says
it just baffles my mind. Like, at what point do you go, I think we should use ant eggs?
Well, it gets worse. Okay. So he says Trotta, he's giving alternatives. So, if you don't have access to the orpiment or whatever, he'll find other ways for you to remove this hair, because it was so important for women to be able to remove this hair. He had to include a couple of different recipes. So he says Trotta, this woman who was a medical authority in Salerno, she takes, again, ant eggs, which I don't know why that, maybe just because they were readily available, but she takes ant eggs, she dips them in oil in which a hedgehog has been cooked. So you cook your hedgehog.
Okay.
You have oil.
As you do.
Yes, as you do, casual. You put the ant eggs in it, and then you take that mixture and you put that mixture, on your hairline. If you want your hairline to go back further, you put that mixture in between your eyebrows. If you need to get rid of any hairs there. And then if you don't, want to mess around with the hedgehog, you can take snails and frogs and cook them in vinegar, and then take the excess fat and you can put that on the place where you want to remove hair and keep hair from growing. So again, sounds really disgusting, but these ingredients would have been pretty readily available for a lot of women. You wouldn't have to spend tons and tons of money to get this hair removal cream or whatever it is that you're willing to put on your face, but you would have to just find these key ingredients that you could really forage for, and find yourself, which to us, it seems really gross, but women were doing it. It was a price that they were willing to pay to try and achieve this beauty standard. We have other recipes, and I won't, go to length on them because there are just so many recipes in this one manual that they're so interesting. But I will tell you that they had 9 recipes for freckle removal, and I take that personally because have freckles, and I'm reading this manual, and the thing was really hard to translate. It was kind of a beast to translate this thing because my Anglo-Norman isn't not my native language, not anyone's native language. But as I was translating it, it was like I'm going through this source and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a recipe to remove freckles. That's weird. And then there was another one. And then there was another, and there were nine recipes to remove freckles. And I'll read one because it's interesting. He says, many unpleasant things may occur on the face, such as freckles and other diseases, which I'm like,
diseases?
Relax. Some people, Taylor Swift puts freckles on her face on purpose, but not the case in the Middle Ages, apparently. Yeah. He says, freckles are able to be removed in this way. Some people take 2 eggs of chickens and put them in white vinegar and leave until the shells are tender. Then take a good handful of mustard flour and mix with the eggs and with a little vinegar and pass through a cloth. So you're trying to kind of distill it a little bit. And rub that on the face with this preparation and leave it all night, wash away in the morning with pure water, and do this until your freckles go away. So it's easy to imagine these poor women who had freckles on their faces, and they were like, oh my gosh, I'm diseased from being outside, working in the fields, trying to live and provide for myself and my family. But they're so desperate to get rid of these freckles that they're taking their chicken eggs and they're mixing them with mustard and vinegar, and they're just rubbing them on their face and thinking about just doing that over and over again. And almost all of the freckle recipes, it has to be repeated. It's not a quick fix. It's not like the hair removal to where, you're boiling a hedgehog, you slap that stuff on your forehead, boom, your hair's not there anymore. But with the freckle ones, you're having to do this night after night after night. But again, it's interesting because a couple of them are saying when you're in the bath at night, put this on your face, which most people who are familiar with the medieval period, they think that people never bathe, right? They think that people aren't clean. They think that they're not doing these things to take care of themselves and their bodies because it was just filthy and dirty and disgusting. But this cosmetic treatise really flips that on its head. Not only are these women automatically taking baths or cleaning themselves, at night, because he's referring to that as just being and of course, that's something that just women do. But they're going out of their way to make themselves appear a certain way because to them, that's important. So they're obviously caring about their appearance. They're caring about their bodies, whether it's because they feel like they have to, because we have all of these literary sources saying, if you don't, you have a beard like a goat and you're, a bad guy. But I think it challenges just popular understandings or misunderstandings, in my opinion, of the medieval period as being, gross and disgusting and so stinky. I don't think that was the case. And I think that if we look at sources like this, it kind of helps us, to better understand what women were doing on a daily basis to care for their bodies,
Yeah.
themselves, that we sometimes miss.
I do have a question for you. Now that we're talking about basically bleaching your skin to remove
Yeah.
freckles, did they ever do any type of hair bleaching to have
Yes,
that lighter color hair?
it did. Yeah, you can actually find, and I didn't write them down just because I didn't want to get too in the weeds with this stuff. But if you're interested, I can send some your way, Rebecca. But they
Yeah.
have a ton of recipes for hair dye for all different colors too. So you have this blonde hair that is just repeated in these sources as being sort of like the ideal hair color. That's the color of beauty. That's the color we think of when we think of, Helen of Troy, who was one of these famous beauties that they talk about a lot in the medieval period, or Elizabeth Woodville. You think of her blonde
Mhm.
hair, but they also had hair dye with different like ointments, different ingredients that you could put on your hair to make it black. They have some recipes to make your hair brown. They have some recipes to make your hair red. And again, that's in this source, but it also pops up in other sources. So in sources that we wouldn't really expect to see references to hair dye, like a 14th century French conduct manual that actually that's the source that it's close to my heart because it kicked off this entire dissertation that I've written on women's faces and what they meant in the Middle Ages. But in this conduct manual, you wouldn't expect references to hair dye. But he talks about women dyeing their hair, and he's very dramatic about it. The guy who wrote that book, he's dramatic about a lot of things, to be fair. But he's talking about these women who dyed their hair and how they walked into a church and the church just like collapsed around them because they had dared to change their hair color. And why would they change something that God created? And I mean, it was so embedded that women would change their hair color that he's using it as an example in this conduct manual where and I mean, he talks about eyebrow plucking and stuff like that too. He's talking about this like whole gamut of women's beautification practices that he just severely disapproves of. But you see it popping up there that women were changing their hair color and they were changing their hairstyle with things like curling irons and ribbons and stuff that I don't think we really think about. But it kind of enriches, I think, our understanding of what women would have been doing, in the 1200s, 1300s, up until really the time of Henry VIII.
I'm so intrigued. You said curling irons. How on
I
earth did
know.
they curl hair?
I don't know. That's one of the things that I would love to figure it out. I would assume that it's probably something along the lines of a metal rod that would be heated over a fire, and then they would use that to curl their hair. So really not that far off from our modern curling irons, just, without electricity, but they would have, had access to fire at the time. Most women, would have had pretty easy access to that. So if they could get their hands on a metal rod, they could likely use it to curl their hair. But that's one of those things that I'm like, I have to find out more about this. With my dissertation, I had to limit myself a little bit. Hair seems like it took on a life of its own in the Middle Ages. I did think about including it because I wanted to talk about the different hairstyles, like, those big horn hairstyles that
Yeah.
women had sticking out of their heads. I think that's all very fascinating. And, veils, everything that went along with, hair options and hairstyles that women pursued, I think is very cool. I had to kick it out in my dissertation because that thing would have ended up being 500 pages instead of 300. And I had to limit myself to just your actual face. There's also a lot of discourse on women's necks, which is interesting too, but I didn't get to include any of it.
Next,
I
man.
really got to include like ears and teeth and stuff, but I think I'm able to justify including that in my dissertation. But there had to be a cutoff somewhere. But I would love to dive into that stuff, a little bit more, because it very much was like a package deal for women. I think that they knew what it meant to be considered beautiful and they knew how to achieve it. And they had all of these recipes and all of these tools to help them achieve it if they wanted to. And of course, like today, I'm sure there were a lot of women who could care less about achieving these beauty ideals, but there were a lot of women who I think probably did really care about that, because it was seen as being indicative of a woman's intrinsic value or her intrinsic worth. That we haven't come super far from that, to where a woman's worth is based on her external appearance. That's something that we're seeing definitely from the 12th century on. Been trying to trace that back a little bit, but source survival wasn't great, in the early Middle Ages and even a bit in the Central Middle Ages. So
Yeah.
Work in progress.
Yeah, no doubt. We still have a ways to go. So now where are we in time? So we started in the 12th century. How far have we progressed?
So the 13th century is where we get that cosmetic treatise, to where we're having all of those different recipes about the ant eggs. And that's also where we have the peddler lyrics talking about his curling iron and his tweezers that he's selling. Then if you want to talk about the 14th century a little bit, which is a century of crisis. So it's surprising to think that, oh my gosh, people were still concerned about their external appearances when there's famine and there's war and there's, the bubonic plague, and everyone around you is dying. But we do know that they were still concerned with their external appearance, because that's when we get things like that conduct manual, where it's called the Book of the Knight of the Tower, in its English translation. Its original French was written around the year 1370. And the guy who wrote that conduct manual, he's claiming that he's writing it for his daughters. He has 3 daughters who he wants to write this manual for, to teach them how to be good young women. But we know that this manual, probably intentionally so, but it took on a life of its own. It was so popular. We have people reading it throughout the period. William Caxton translated it in England, and he actually says that he translated this manual because a noblewoman told him to translate it to educate England's young nobility and the gentry. So some people have argued, I don't know where I fall on it, but some historians have argued that Elizabeth Woodville or maybe Margaret Beaufort would be the one who told William Caxton to translate this particular conduct manual. And in that conduct manual, we have all of these examples of what the author considers to be inappropriate behavior by young women, where they are using cosmetics, they are putting blush on their face, they are using tweezers to remove eyebrow hair, they're dyeing their hair. They're doing all of these things that he doesn't want them to do. He's very uncomfortable with women using makeup. And he says that if you are using makeup, you are changing God's creation. You are doing an act of deceit, because you're putting this makeup on and you're presenting yourself to the men in your life, and they're going to marry you, and then they're going to see you and when you don't have makeup on, and you look like a completely different person. And this, again, it's something that we can find in a lot of sources, way more than just this conduct manual. But the conduct manual includes some really impactful examples that I think women who were reading it or listening to this manual, they weren't quick to forget. So he gives one example, and again, I'll limit myself because I could talk about the Book of the Knight of the Tower for probably 8 years without things to say. I know that manual like the back of my hand because it's what kicked off this topic for me. But he gives an example of a woman who she died and she went to hell. And this hermit saw her in hell. And what he saw shocked him, because a devil was holding her by the hair of her head. And he was stabbing her in the brain with a burning needle through every hole in her eyebrows from which she had removed a hair during her lifetime. So she was plucking her eyebrows, right? Trying to achieve this beauty standard that we see across all of these sources, innocent enough, right? But when she died, she had to pay for that sin. And I mean, he talks about women who did things that I think most of us would consider to be far worse than plucking your eyebrows. And yeah, they were in hell, but they weren't described. Their eternal punishment wasn't described in the same descriptive terms as this poor woman who, was having this happen to her because she had dared to remove her eyebrow hair. And it wasn't only happening once, it was happening every day for eternity, because she had removed hair from her eyebrows during her lifetime. So you can think of just like the mixed messaging that women had to be like, what am I supposed to do? Because on the one hand, you have all of these sources telling you what it is to be beautiful. They're describing the beauty standard. They're saying exactly what you're supposed to look like to be considered beautiful and why that's important, because it signifies your inner qualities. It shows that you're not only beautiful on the outside, but at that time, your outside was expected to reflect the inside. So it's, it's reflecting a beautiful soul and it's reflecting your internal characteristics. Whereas if you're ugly, like the loathly damsel with, the goat beard and the horns, she, was a bad person, a bad character. And she, her ugliness or her external appearance really reflected that. So on the one hand, you have these sources really promoting beauty. You have these cosmetic manuals, these treatises, these different materials that people are selling to help you achieve that beauty standard. Then on the other hand, you have people like the author of the book of the Knight of the Tower, and even a lot of church authorities who are saying things like, whoa, if you use cosmetics or if you use tweezers or hair dye, if you change anything about your external appearance, you're showing a disregard for God because he created you in his own likeness. And you're showing that you are more than willing to use deceit to your advantage. So it was just like, it was such a catch-22 for these women because they were expected to look a certain way, but it had to be natural. And it's not like that's not a natural way, that people look, that your face is a perfect mixture of white and red, but neither and both at the same time. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but it was something that they were expected to be able to achieve naturally. And if they tried to take any of these quote unquote unnatural means, through ant eggs or what have you, to achieve this look, all of a sudden, they were going to spend eternity in hell paying for it. So I think it's very much an example of how women were kind of pulled in every direction in the medieval period that, again, not too much has changed. But for them, I think for a modern audience, a lot of people would be able to kind of separate out what these texts are saying, based on the author's opinions, and then a woman's own internal sense of self. In the Middle Ages, I think they would have been able to do that to some extent, but I think also, especially the religious threats and the religious language that we find in a lot of these sources would have scared a lot of women too, which of course, I mean, it was very evocative and it scary language. That's what it was intended to do. So it's not, I think it's a rich topic to study, but it's not one that I think is black and white. There's a lot of gray space. For the women who were the audience for these different texts and how they would have used these texts to understand themselves and, change their appearance to communicate something to onlookers because it wasn't very straightforward. It had a lot of twists and turns.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. What comes to mind when you hear the word gratitude? Maybe it's a daily practice, or maybe it feels hard to be grateful right now. Don't forget to give yourself some thanks by investing in your well-being. BetterHelp is the largest online therapy provider in the world, connecting you to qualified professionals via phone, video, or message chat. Let the gratitude flow. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
10 years from today, Lisa Schneider will trade in her office job to become the leader of a pack of dogs. As the owner of her own dog rescue, that is. A second act made possible by the reskilling courses Lisa's taking now with AARP to help make sure her income lives as long as she does. And she can finally run with the big dogs. And the small dogs, who just think they're big dogs. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/skills.
Well, we have to remember, right? This is always the time in history when life revolved around the church. And so how conflicting would that be? The church is telling me this is a sin, and yet society is telling me that this is what I need to do. So
Exactly. And not just what you need to do, for yourself. And I do want to be, mindful of time, but I would love, if I have a minute, I would love to include an example that I found in a Spanish source from the 14th century that is talking about how men could read women's exterior to try and find a good wife. So it's called the Book of Good Love. And in it, the author, he's telling men, okay, here's like a checklist. This is what you look for. If you want to find a good wife, here's how you're going to identify her. And this is what he says. He says, look for a woman with a good figure and with a small head, hair that is blonde, but not from henna. So that's where you get some of your hair dye, whose eyebrows are spaced apart, long and arched in a peak, who is nice and plump in the buttocks.
Oh,
A slight warning, content warning, if you have any young listeners, it gets worse. This is the figure of a lady whose eyes are large, prominent, colorful, shining, and with long lashes that show good and clearly, with small, delicate ears. Mark well if she has a long throat. That is the kind men want. A finely chiseled nose and nice small teeth that are even and good and white, a trifle separated, with red gums. So literally talking about like women's like oral health, with red gums, good sharp teeth, her lips red and nicely fine drawn, her mouth small, nice and small, just so in a pleasing way, her face white, hairless, bright, and smooth. Try to get hold of some woman who can see her without her blouse on, tell you about the form of her body. And then he ends it by saying, arrange this, like make this happen. So he's very much, I mean, it's all a woman's exterior, right? It's all based on what a woman looks like. You don't have to talk to this woman to know, what she's like. You have to look at her or find someone else to look at her and to report back to tell you what she looked like, because that's how you're going to find a good wife. So to the women who were living at this time, their external appearance wasn't just something that was based on trends or fads, something that they wanted to do for themselves. Their external appearance, according to some of these sources, is what would have made them marriage material. And to a lot of women, they wanted, to make advantageous marriages because they had to, whether it was something they wanted to do for themselves or not. A lot of them didn't have any choice. But men were clearly analyzing what these women look like to see if it's someone who they wanted to marry. It was their external appearance. That's what, according to this Book of Good Love, that's what you looked for. That's how you evaluated a woman to tell if she was a good woman, if she was worthy of being your wife. So it's very much a very integral aspect of a woman's life, I think, to a certain extent for a lot of women, what they look like and how they look to others. And of course, they would do anything, in their power to try and achieve this particular look. If they had access to cosmetics or these beautifying treatments, why wouldn't they, try to use those to their advantage? But then you have the religious side of it where they're saying, absolutely not, you're going to go to hell if you do this. So it's very much mixed messaging, to put it lightly. Some conflicting areas of advice, I think, for medieval women, and it just had to seem like an impossible choice, I think, for a lot of women to make.
Yeah. And, and we talk about the ideal image, which is the light skin, the light hair, the blue eyes, the long neck, the perfect eyebrows, the perfect this. And then we fast forward to the Renaissance period, and let's say Henry VIII, right? And now here's Henry VIII looking for a new bride. He's asking for portraits. He wants to see what these women look like.
Exactly. Yeah, and then he, allegedly rejects Anne of Cleves because she, isn't up to his standards. And then we see someone like Anne Boleyn, who she didn't fit into this beauty ideal. She, didn't have the light hair, the light eye color, the light skin color that we see in people like Henry VIII's grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville, which I think can be easy to forget that she was his grandmother and very much passed down some of those genes to his mother, who looked a specific way, Elizabeth of York, from what we can tell from her portraiture and descriptions of her. But then you have Anne Boleyn, who she flips that on its head. He obviously is still, attracted to her because of the lengths that he went to make her his wife. But then we see these later sources, they're using Anne Boleyn's external appearance to villainize her. Again, to talk about how she, had this dark and swarthy complexion, and she had the dark hair and the how many extra fingers, what have you. Which isn't true, but, is something that pops up in some of these sources, because, again, you could communicate a lot about a woman's internal character through descriptions of her external appearance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is interesting. It's interesting how it was so intricately tied together at the time, that you don't have to talk about a character's internal character. You don't have to talk about, was she nice? Was she kind? Was she even like polite? Which is something that they cared about a lot. But you don't have to talk about that in the Arthurian legends. You don't have to talk about that in the Romance of the Rose. You just don't have to. You talk about what she looked like, and your audience knows what that means. Yeah. Which is interesting. It's interesting to think about it from a literature standpoint, but then to also think about how that must have impacted the real women who were living through this, and how it impacted how they understood themselves, and then how other people understood them and their relationships, that they had, not just to others, but to their own bodies. I think it's a rich area of exploration that I hope to dive into a bit more. I'm not done with it, even though, sorry about that, Rebecca. I set a timer so that I wouldn't talk too long about this stuff because I keep talking about it. But it's something that I think there's a lot of fertile ground there to try to uncover a bit more about what this meant to real women who were living through this, and the mixed messages that just had to really impact them, on just the deepest level.
This was such a fascinating conversation. I'm going to have you back again to talk more about this, because...
And that's only 2 chapters.
Well, you definitely have to come back soon so that we can... Yes. I know this will be a very popular topic. People will be really interested in hearing about.
And honestly, I mean, if you all want to know more, especially those recipes, that manuscript is such an understudied manuscript, and it's so cool. I mean, you'd have to go with my translations. It's never been translated into English, so they're all my own translations, which I'm a little nervous about. But I spent months transcribing and translating that manuscript. So if any of your listeners, especially, are interested in learning more about women's cosmetic recipes and procedures, please let me know. I'm more than happy, to share anything that I found in that manuscript, because I just think it is such cool insight into the medieval period in a way that I don't think we typically think about women's experiences back then. But it gives us some really cool insight into what they were doing. I mean, I'll never look at ants the same way.
The ant eggs, yeah. Lacey, if people want to find you on social media, how can they find you?
So I am on Twitter, or the X now. And I should have checked all of my names, but I think I'm just at Lacey, Lacey, Bonar, B as in boy, Onar, Hull, Hull. I think I'm probably the same on Instagram. And then I'm trying to get TikTok up and running, which I think I am the same on TikTok as well. So I'm on those 3 social media platforms. Sometimes I offer online classes through a website I run called the medievalhistoryacademy.com, where I have a class on the Princes in the Tower, which also I want to talk about that sometime, Rebecca. I have a lot from the women's point of view of the Princes in the Tower.
That's, you know what? Maybe that's our next episode.
It might be. It's a scandalously understudied aspect of the mystery, in my opinion. Elizabeth Woodville pops up a lot just in my daily life. So she pops up a lot in my thinking about the Princes in the Tower, and has kind of changed things for me, I think, a little bit on that mystery. And then I have a class on women in medieval England, where we talk about a lot of this kind of stuff. Women's history that's really where my heart is, and where it always has been for the medieval and the Tudor period. So if anyone wants to chat further about any of that stuff, you or any of your listeners, Rebecca, I am more than happy to do so. As you can tell by me going over my timer that I set to tell myself that I had already talked for over an hour.
Well, Lacey, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm going to have you back again soon so that we can talk more.
I would love it. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It was so good to catch up.
Thank you. And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.